Back in the late 1990s, Japanese television had a hit about a naked man surviving from prize coupons played for laughs. Now the full story is told in The Contestant. I'm Thom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. The Contestant takes us back to the dawn of reality TV. Before Big Brother, Survivor, or even The Truman Show, a Japanese TV producer named Toshio Tsuchiya had a hit program called Denpa Shonen, featuring young people doing crazy stunts. There were no consent forms, no guidelines. The only rule was to get a big audience. Stepping into this world was an aspiring comedian called Nasubi. He earned that name, meaning eggplant, for the shape of his long face. As a kid, he was bullied and teased over his looks. He turned to comedy as a way to deflect. Nasubi moved from his hometown of Fukushima to Tokyo to make it in show business and went to a fateful audition for Denpa Shonen. The producer, Toshio, brought Nasubi to a room and told him to strip naked. The room contained a table, a rack of magazines, and little else. Nasubi was instructed that in order to win the contest, he had to fill out magazine sweepstakes coupons until he reached 1 million yen worth of prizes. In order to get food or clothing, he had to win them. Nasubi accepted the challenge, thinking he was still auditioning for a part. He didn't know that his life in isolation was being filmed and turned into a weekly TV program that had millions of viewers. It sounds crazy, but this went on for more than a year. Nasubi's story has been covered partially by others. 10 years ago, This American Life producer, Stephanie Fu, had a memorable radio segment. First-time filmmaker Clair Titley heard that piece in London and was keen to know more, including what happened to Nasubi after Denpa Shonen. In 2011, his hometown of Fukushima was devastated by the tsunami that destroyed a nuclear power plant. That changed his life again. Claire gained the cooperation of Nasubi, the notorious producer Toshio, and others who worked on Denpa Shonen. She teamed up with the Japanese-British producer Megumi Inman and the production company Misfits. The film premiered last year at the Toronto International Film Festival and played as the opening night of Doc NYC, where Nasubi received a standing ovation. It's now streaming on Hulu. I sat down with Claire last week in New York City, the School of Visual Arts. I asked what pulled her into this story.
I was doing some research on another couple of projects, and I fell down one of those kind of internet rabbit holes. You know, when you're supposed to be working on something else and then you kind of get distracted and somehow you find that, oh God, you know, half an hour's gone by, an hour's gone by, and I'm kind of, this story is much more interesting than what I'm working on. So I found Nasubi's story and I was just intrigued by it. And I also found that everything that had been, not everything, but a lot of what had been written about his story, the Denpa Shonen, was quite simplistic about what had happened, and I felt almost derogatory in a kind of a point and laugh at the Japanese culture. And so I really wanted to get to kind of more the human side of the story and Nasubi's story. And so when I approached him, I was quite clear that this is what I wanted to do, and that's the kind of approach that I wanted to make.
So what was that conversation like? Because he's been in the media in multiple different ways. Was he at all reluctant? Was happy to do it? What was his response?
Well, to start with, I was writing him emails and having a translator to translate them for me, and then I would get his back. And I'd sort of, rather than pay for a translator, I decided to take it to my neighbor and for her to translate. And she started reading it out to me and it said, "I'm ever so sorry." And it started with all these apologies. And I thought, oh, he's turning me down. And then I realized that Nasubi is incredibly polite. And if you meet him, you'll kind of get, he's he's very formal as well, and he'd used all this Japanese formal language, which is basically apologies the whole way through. But he said no, that he would talk to me, and I think consent was such an important part of it, and I was just very open with him about the fact that this, we could work on this. It could never get made. We might never get funding. But this is what I wanted to do, and I was clear that I wanted to work with him to tell his story. He never had editorial control, but I wanted to work with him and get his feedback the whole way through. So I think that's maybe how I won him over.
So tell me more about that, about what you were prepared to do in telling his story, and to what extent were you willing to give Nasubi a sense of input, and to what extent were you trying to maintain your own editorial control?
So I wanted him to feel part of the process. I wanted him to be a part of the process. This was the first time that he'd really told his story in that much depth. So I would go back to him and tell him what we were doing and why we were doing it. And he didn't have any control, any editorial control, and that is important to me, because I don't want my characters to feel like that, to have that control over the narrative. That's important. But with this particular film, because it was about his story and his life, I felt that he could input into it. So, for example, once we'd done the interview, we were then shooting visuals to go alongside it, and actually some of them didn't make the cut, but I told him what we were doing, and I asked him sort of suggestions, creative ideas as to how we might be able to interpret certain elements of his story, and he came up with ideas, some of which we kind of incorporated. So and he also got to see the edit at various stages along the way. I wanted to make sure that we didn't misrepresent anything. I was working with Megumi Inman, a Japanese-British producer, and various interpreters. But still, I didn't want things to get lost in translation, or lost in a kind of I was aware of my role as a Westerner telling an Asian story. I didn't want to get it wrong, so to speak.
In that process, was there ever anything he had a tough time with?
I was worried about him, about showing so much of the archive, because he's naked in it. And I was really concerned about re-traumatizing him. That's another reason for talking to him so much when making the film. But actually, it was funny when we showed him one of the, sort of a rough cut of the film. Some of the things that he was anxious and nervous about wasn't necessarily him being naked. It was scenes where we'd used lots of his face kind of close up on a big screen. And I think that kind of speaks to all of us. When you look at something, you don't want to hear, I hate the sound of my own voice.
Sure.
It doesn't. You could be a model and hate your face. I think it's more. I think that kind of speaks to our innate kind of fear of being of
a
exposure.
Natural self-consciousness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now let me ask about the other major figure in this, the producer, who many people kind of interpret as a villain character in the piece. What was it like getting his involvement?
I was so surprised and kind of grateful when he did say he'd take part, but it was actually Nasubi who asked him to be involved in the project, and he said yes, and he didn't shy away from it. And while I can't speak for Toshio Tsuchiya, the producer, I feel that perhaps part of his involvement in the film was an apology, was his kind of redemption, was his way of making amends in some way. Not that he said this outright, but this is what I feel. And while I, have my own sort of personal feelings about what it was that he did to Nasubi, I do have a lot of respect for him and admiration for the way that he took part in this project. And he's a producer, he's a filmmaker. he had no, he's not daft. He knows that we will put all these questions to him, and he understands the editing process. And he put himself out there, he put himself in our hands and was brutally honest and didn't hold back. So he was quite brave, I suppose. So for that, I'm quite grateful to him.
Mm-hmm. Another memorable figure in here is Nasibi's mother. So his family had big reservations about him going into show business in the first place. The way it turned out was beyond their worst fears, and so what was it like to interview the family?
I was worried about interviewing his mum in particular, particularly because I got the impression that it's not actually something that they talked about. I think Nasibi would agree that they're not the kind of family that discusses things openly. And it was definitely the case with Nasibi that when we started talking with him, there are things that he hadn't actually unpacked yet. But if that was the case with Nasibi, it was even more so with his mum. And I think that she found the process probably quite difficult, but also maybe with the distance of time, I think she's found it quite, it's hard to speak on her behalf, but therapeutic. Is therapeutic the word? Cathartic. That's maybe the word.
You talked about working with a Japanese producer on this. How did you work together, and what do they bring?
So Megumi Inman was involved from the start, which was great. And we'd always had this intention for the interviews in particular to be that Meg would be in front of the camera, and she would be the person that Nasibi and the Japanese-speaking characters would speak to directly. She's a talented individual interviewer herself. But we very much believed that we wanted our interviewees to be able to speak to somebody directly who could interview them and understand what they were saying in the real moment, and not have to have that barrier that you have when you go through an interpreter. Because however much you try, there's always this kind of delay, and you lose that intimacy. So we spoke a lot about that beforehand. And then we were kind of thrown a curveball, which was COVID. And we'd kind of put off the interviews and we put off the filming, and we were all kind of hoping that Japan would start letting people into the country. But it turned out they weren't letting anybody in who didn't have a Japanese passport. So we had to kind of make a call. And so Meg, as I said, we always intended to do the interviews in this way. But what happened was, rather than me being kind of like a couple of meters behind the camera, I was like several thousand miles behind the camera. So I did all the interviews remotely. But what we also did as well was Meg had to do 2 weeks quarantine in Japan, and it's very meta actually, because she was trapped in a hotel room with no communication with the outside
because
world.
She's based in the UK?
She's based in the UK, sorry.
But she had a Japanese passport that would allow her to enter the country during COVID.
Exactly. So so she went over there. She had this 2 weeks of quarantine kind of by herself in this room. So I decided to get on Japanese time and do her quarantine with her. So remotely. So it was a kind of a crazy, I would kind of be up all night with her, and we had all this time to talk about our plans for the shoot, our kind of theories of interviewing, our kind of, literally sort of shoot the breeze and really become one. And then I would... 3:00 in the afternoon, my daughter would kind of kiss me goodnight, and I would go to bed and kind of wake up again at midnight and sort of start the whole Japanese day again. And so I did that for 5 weeks. But it meant that what was supposed to be a disaster, doing it remotely, we ended up being the most prepared shoot that we possibly could have been. And Meg and I kind of became the same person. Really, it was quite mad. I mean, I wouldn't wish it again, but there were weird advantages that kind of came out as a result of it.
I want to ask you about finding the archival footage and what it took to get access to that, and did it all come in one big batch, or was it more piecemeal than that?
When I first started the development research on the project, the only way I could get hold of footage of the archive was either through YouTube, and I was trying to piece bits together because everybody's re-edited stuff with their own bits and pieces, or I had a neighbor who was a Japanese interpreter who I was kind of paying in tea and cookies, who would kind of help me out with things. And we would order all these VHS tapes, compilation tapes of Denpa Shonen from Japanese eBay, and then kind of work our way through them. Wow. So we were working on this basis. And then obviously when the production was kind of financed, we could go back to Nippon and start getting the footage. And that was quite a long process. And strange, just negotiating the archive from a logistical point of view, because it was being funded in the US, in LA, and there was us in the UK, and then there was Tokyo, so we had lawyers in each location, and trying to get lawyers to meet up anyway, let alone on 3 time zones, was hell. And trying to negotiate these rights. But by some weird uncanny coincidence, the person who was actually integral to helping us get that archive was Toshio Tsuchiya, the producer. Mm-hmm. He used to work at Nippon, obviously, and he used his influence and his connections to kind of grease the wheels, to kind of make sure we were talking to the right people, just to help it move along. So when all that footage finally came through, that was amazing, because there were things that we hadn't seen. But then, funnily, there were things that they didn't give us that we'd seen because we'd been trawling eBay for. So we could go back to them and go, hang on a second, what about this scene over here, or this particular shot over here?
So tell me more what that was like, immersing yourself in Nasubi's life in that room. Watching the condensed version that we see in the film can be harrowing enough, and I'm curious what it was like for you and your team going even further into it.
I really wanted like an English-speaking audience to really get how intense that footage is to watch if you're a Japanese speaker, because you've got Nasubi in the room, there's all this graphics over the top, they put boing boing noises, and there's sound effects, and then there's a voiceover, and then you can hear Nasubi's voice, and then they have a different voice for the diaries, and it's an onslaught for the senses. And so translating that would have been really hard. So we as with subtitles, so we painstakingly I say removed the Japanese graphics, but actually it was a flat image. It was VHS pretty much quality that we had. Jason Martin, the VFX guy, did an incredible job of basically translating those graphics into English, so that you had this immediacy when you watched it of what it was like. And Fred Armisen did a fantastic job of doing replacing the voiceover that was there, so you got a real sense of what it was like. But then at the same time, we wanted to do the opposite of that, because we wanted people to know what it was like to have seen the rushes, the dailies, and we didn't have them. They'd thrown them out. So again, we stripped back as much as we could, through magic, I'd like to say, but VFX, the magic of VFX, all the other stuff that was on the screen. So all you were left with was Nasubi naked in a room, and we rebuilt the soundscape in a lot of places as well. And that was, I think, the first time I saw what we were kind of referring to as like the fake rushes, the fake dailies. That was quite emotional, actually, because we hadn't seen that before. And we had a real sense of what it, how lonely it was. I think loneliness was the thing that kind of came out for the first time when we did that.
I don't know much about your background before this project, but my understanding this is your first feature-length documentary, and it turned into such a big project that it's the kind of thing that I've seen in the past. Someone more experienced step in and say, "Let me do this. Why don't you co-direct this for me?" So I wonder what it was like for you, undertaking this international project that, seemed to start organically with you as a researcher and then grow into something bigger.
This has been a long time going, this project, and there were times in the early days when I would take it and pitch it to people and they go, "This is great, Claire, but no, you can't make it," or we need to get somebody else on. And sometimes you go, okay, or you try, you're just desperate to get it made. But I was really lucky. I mustn't say that. I was really talented. I was really fortunate to meet Andy Ryder and Misfits. And from the moment that we started speaking, she totally got my vision, totally sort of didn't for a moment question that I was capable of doing it, that with their support that we could make this happen. So I felt really supported the whole way through. And it's been lovely and really not just supported, really listened to, which is hard, particularly as a female filmmaker. Quite often people hear you, but they're not listening at all, and they're either repeating your ideas as back as their own, or they can you're dismissed a little bit. And I haven't felt like this with this project at all. I keep kind of pinching myself and waiting for someone to turn around and say, well, but it's been great actually, and it's respect to their faith in the project, I suppose, as well.
When I first saw the film, one of the questions I asked to you is if anyone in Japan who had been part of this process, part of putting through Nasabi through all this, had now looked back on it with big regrets, or if people look back on it as a turning point in reality television that was, a regretful thing. And if I remember correctly, you said, I didn't encounter a lot of that second guessing amongst the people that you talked to who were part of it. Can you explain that?
Looking back now, you mean, as
Yeah.
in like on that way? I think there's a couple in terms of the audience. Are we talking about audience or people who
kind of anyone who was,
Yeah.
I mean, I was wondering, there's a room full of people in a big reveal moment
Yeah.
that is traumatizing, humiliating for Nasabi. And I was wondering, is there anyone in that audience who, interviewed today would say, oh gosh, when I look back on that, I feel really weird about having been part of a cheering audience?
I think people would have done, and if one person who kind of does feel weird, I don't know if she was cheering, but was Juliet Hindle, who was the BBC journalist who was there at the time, and she does talk about that. In terms of...
I guess I thought of her differently because she comes to it from a journalistic distance, and I was curious about people who were actually part of it.
In terms of like the audience and this is anecdotally, but everybody I've spoken to who was Japanese and maybe watching at the time, they weren't aware of the fact that Nasabi didn't know he was on air. They didn't know that he didn't know that he was on air. So whether he was part of it or not, there's a couple of things that I think we need to remind ourselves of, and that's that when people were both making it and also in watching it, when we watch it now, we're looking back with 20 years worth of like a baggage, of kind of like reality TV history. And they just didn't have that. They didn't have, this is pre Big Brother, this is pre Survivor, pre even the Truman Show film coming, that came out while he was in there. So nobody had this idea of quite what reality TV was or what it could do. And I think they were maybe it's a cultural thing as well, being that trusting of television. And how it could manipulate ordinary people. You had to struggle to be famous back in the late 90s. If you wanted your 15 minutes of fame, that was, whereas you or I could walk out and take a picture and, well, maybe
go
not
viral. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe not me, maybe you, but but so there's that kind of side of things, I think. And the other thing is that back then in Japan in the 1990s, and quite frankly, I know in the UK and probably in the US, it was the Wild West, really, of kind of filmmaking. Anything went. You could, certainly in Japan, people weren't signing contracts. That was kind of normal. Producers had a lot of power. If something was a hit, then they were like, well, just go with it, and they could follow their gut and do what they wanted. So that's kind of how they got away with it.
As you were editing the film and I guess sharing rough cuts with Nasubi, what feedback were you getting?
I think Nasubi found it quite emotional rewatching things. I think also, of course, he was seeing what other people were saying about him for the first time in some instances. His friends, Suchiya, Juliet, the journalist, and watching it with that slight kind of removal, I suppose. I think that was quite something for him. I think it's all been quite a journey for him, and actually releasing the film, having the film shown in film festivals has been quite a big deal. And when he was at Doc NYC in November, it was the first time he'd seen it with an audience, and it was really powerful for him, really, really powerful. I'd been telling him for ages, look, Nasubi, people are going to love you. It's all going to be great. No one's going to belittle you. It's all good. And while he said yes, I'm not sure he actually believed me. And so when he got up on stage and he got a standing ovation, and he was moved to tears, I think that was quite a turning point for him.
And where is he in his life right now? What do you think the film means to him coming out?
He's now doing he does a lot of radio, he does a lot of theatre acting as well. One thing he forgets to tell everybody is that he does a lot of charity work. And Fukushima is incredibly important to him. That's one of the things early on in the process when we spoke. We made a bit of a pact together that this would be that Fukushima would feature prominently in the film, and it would be a part of it. I don't like to make promises to anybody about anything, but I said, look, I will do my best to make sure that is a significant part of the film, because it means, so much to him. So I think for him, getting the word out about Fukushima, globally is going to be a really big deal for him. And just telling his story to new audiences who don't remember him from back then, and telling his truth, really.
You're here in New York with him, doing interviews. What are the things that he says about the film now?
I think he's proud of the film. I think he's proud of what he's achieved, and it's quite nice maybe that somebody else has framed that for him and put it in a package and said, look, here's what you've done, and let's celebrate it. So I think that's been great for him, and to be listened to, and to sort of tell his truth, tell his story, and talk about some of the issues that are important to him. he's been quite he's talked openly about how mental health in Japan is still quite a relatively taboo subject, talking about having those suicidal thoughts and how he's dealt with various things. I think having that opportunity and having almost a foreign audience has been quite a good thing for him.
I want to ask what the emotional center of this project has been for you. Sometimes it's obvious, it's on screen, and sometimes it's not so obvious what the meaning was for the director in this process. But what was the biggest emotional part of making this film for you?
It's been, I think you start a film feeling that it's about one thing, and then as it goes on, you kind of change your mind at every step of the process, and I started out thinking, oh, this is a film all about resilience and strength of human spirit and character, and it is about that, and then I felt that it was maybe about forgiveness and much more about maybe that relationship between Tsuchira and Nasabi, and again, it is that, but I think the film made me kind of reflect on my own connections and relationship with media, social media, and I hope that's what other people get from it. And I do feel that it's a film about connection and about a guy who goes in search of connection, maybe looking in the wrong places, but eventually finds it in maybe unusual places.
I want to thank Clair Titley for speaking with me. Her film, The Contestant, is now streaming on Hulu. Thanks to our listeners. Special shout out to Dashiell Cousin, a teenager who follows us in Paris. I learned this from his mother, producer Sally Blake. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Nordenswan, newsletter manager Bella Racklin, and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphael Nehausen. I'm Thom Powers. Follow us on Instagram and sign up for our newsletter at purenonfiction.net.